The first shot was a waste. Captain Elias Voss knew it the moment his finger left the trigger. The bullet streaked across the ruined cityscape, struck the alien soldier squarely in the chest, and did absolutely nothing. No reaction, no stagger. The towering invader simply kept moving, armored boots crunching over debris-strewn asphalt. Voss's spotter, Lieutenant O'Hara, muttered a curse under her breath. Confirmed hit, center mass. No effect. The alien soldiers, known as the Dominion Vanguard, were nearly impervious to Earth's conventional weapons. Their armor, sleek, obsidian black with pulsing blue filaments, deflected or absorbed every shot fired at them. Tanks had been reduced to smoldering wrecks. Fighter jets, cut from the sky by energy lances. And now, the last hope of precision warfare, snipers, had been rendered useless. Voss exhaled slowly and steadied his rifle against the remnants of a collapsed office building. Below, the Dominion patrol advanced through the skeletal remains of what had once been Chicago's financial district. He adjusted his scope, lining up a second shot. Maybe the first had been a fluke. Maybe. He fired again. The bullet zipped through the air, whispering its death sentence toward the enemy commander. Another perfect shot. Another useless impact. The alien barely noticed, save for the faintest ripple across its armor's energy field. Voss gritted his teeth. They don't even feel it. They don't need to, O'Hara said. They don't fear us. That was the problem. The Dominion didn't just possess superior technology. They exuded an unshakable arrogance. To them, humans were primitive, barely above the level of an unruly pest infestation. The kind of species that needed to be subdued, not fought. And so far, they had been right. Voss pulled back from his scope and scanned the ruined city with sharp, calculating eyes. The Vanguard patrol continued unbothered, their massive rifles slung casually across their backs. An execution squad, moving without urgency. Somewhere in the distance, muffled gunfire signaled the last desperate skirmishes of Earth's dwindling forces. Command says the Russians tried detonating a nuke in Moscow, O'Hara muttered, keeping her voice low. Didn't work. Voss closed his eyes for a moment. The thought of nuclear weapons failing didn't just mean defeat. It meant extinction. A burst of static crackled in his earpiece. Voss, this is Sergeant Patel. We've got another group moving west, heavy support units. What's the call? Voss took a steadying breath. He had no orders beyond hold position, but holding a position meant nothing when the war was already lost. Stand by, he replied. The old world had been shattered. Every rule of engagement, every doctrine, every lesson from centuries of warfare, it all meant nothing against an enemy that could not be harmed. Except, maybe that wasn't true. Voss had always believed in one fundamental truth about battle. Anything that live can die. You just have to find the right way. A flicker of movement caught his attention. A solitary Dominion soldier, separate from the patrol, scanning the ruined streets below. Its weapon remained lowered, but its helmet swiveled methodically, scanning, listening, searching for threats, or, more accurately, for sounds. Voss inhaled sharply. The aliens never reacted to the gunshots themselves. They only reacted to what they heard. His mind raced. The Dominion's armor was perfect against direct fire, but if their awareness relied on sound, what if the problem had never been the bullet itself, but the noise that preceded it? O'Hara noticed his sudden shift in focus. What? He unslung his sidearm, a heavily modified pistol equipped with an advanced suppressor. New test. Watch closely. She didn't argue. Voss took careful aim, centering his sights on the isolated soldier's visor slit, the only truly vulnerable gap in the Dominion's armor. He exhaled, letting his heartbeat slow, then squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was nearly silent, no louder than a sharp breath. The bullet zipped through the air and struck its target. The alien collapsed. O'Hara's eyes widened. Holy! The soldier lay still, blue light flickering weakly from its visor before dimming completely. No energy shield had activated. No alarms. The Dominion patrol ahead kept moving, oblivious. Voss's hands tightened around his rifle. The sound hadn't just been a factor. It had been the factor. "Get Patel on the line," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the storm raging in his mind. "Tell him we're about to change the rules of this war." The first silent kill had been a theory. The second had been a test. By the 10th, it was undeniable. The Dominion, for all their technological superiority, were blind without their ability to hear the battle unfold. Voss lay prone atop a ruined parking garage, his rifle resting on a crumbling ledge. 100 yards below, another Vanguard patrol moved through the shattered streets. This one was larger, 15 soldiers, all clad in their signature black armor, their visors scanning for movement. But they weren't searching for threats. They weren't expecting an attack at all. And why would they? Humanity's resistance had been gutted. Their weapons had proven useless. The Dominion had walked through gunfire like gods among mortals. But gods could bleed. Voss exhaled slowly, steadying his aim. His finger found the trigger, and with a barely audible whisper, another shot left the barrel. The bullet traveled the distance in an instant, slipping through the narrow slit of an alien's visor. The Dominion soldier jerked slightly, then crumpled to the ground without a sound. Not one of its comrades reacted. It was almost surreal. For days, Earth's forces had watched in horror as their most devastating weapons bounced off Dominion armor. Now, those same invincible warriors were falling like they were the ones made of flesh and bone. O'Hara lay beside him, her eyes fixed on the patrol. "They still don't know." Voss chambered another round. "Let's make sure they never do." The second shot claimed another. The third took a squad leader. By the fourth, the formation was subtly shifting, the aliens unknowingly adjusting to the absence of their fallen. Not out of fear, not out of caution, just minor corrections in their pattern, as if they had merely lost equipment rather than soldiers. They truly didn't understand. By the time Voss's team had eliminated over half the patrol, the remaining Dominion soldiers finally paused. Their heads turned slightly, their glowing visors flickering as they processed some unseen disturbance. Then, in eerie synchronization, they activated their weapons. They hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard a single shot, but something about the battlefield felt wrong to them. Voss felt his pulse quicken. They're adapting. O'Hara's voice was tight. Not fast enough. The last three fell in rapid succession. The street was silent once more. For the first time since the invasion began, Voss felt something close to hope. A cold, ruthless hope, but hope nonetheless. A burst of static crackled in his earpiece. Patel's voice came through, hushed but urgent. "Captain, command's hearing reports from other sniper teams. They're confirming the same results. Silent shots work." Voss kept scanning the street below. Casualties, none on our side. A pause. But the Dominions starting to notice. Of course they were. Even with their arrogance, even with their inability to hear the battle shifting, they weren't stupid. They relied on patterns, and those patterns were fracturing. Commanders weren't reporting in. Patrols weren't returning. The Dominion wouldn't understand how it was happening. Not yet. But they'd know something had changed. Voss rolled onto his back, staring up at the burnt-out sky. The world was still in ruins. Cities had been reduced to skeletal remains. Entire nations had fallen silent. But for the first time, the war was no longer a one-sided slaughter. The ghosts of Earth had finally found their weapons. Days passed, then a week. The silent war spread like wildfire. Sniper teams coordinated their attacks across the globe, targeting officers, key personnel, command units. With each kill, the Dominion's advance slowed. Not because of logistics, there were always more soldiers to replace the fallen, but because of something far more insidious. Fear. Voss saw it firsthand. He watched through his scope as a Dominion squad hesitated at an intersection, their formations tighter than before, their weapons held higher. No orders had been given. No alarms had sounded. But they felt it. They had once walked the battlefield with impunity. Now, for the first time, they were looking over their shoulders. The fear spread through their ranks like a sickness. Paranoia set in. Entire units refused to move through contested areas. Some abandoned their objectives entirely. It wasn't enough to win the war. Not yet, but it was breaking them. Voss knew it was only a matter of time before the Dominion tried to adapt. The moment they figured out how to counter the silent kills, the advantage would be lost. That meant they had to act before the enemy could adjust. And that meant taking the risk of making their next move loud. Command was hesitant at first. The entire strategy had been built on stealth, on not revealing what little advantage they had. But Voss argued, no, demanded that they needed to strike hard while the aliens were still reeling. And so, the plan was set. A Dominion command post had been established in what remained of Denver. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by a garrison of elite soldiers. But their commanders? Their high-ranking officers? They moved freely within its walls, unafraid, unaware that Earth snipers had turned into something far deadlier than they had ever anticipated. Voss and his team set up 3 miles outside the city, concealed within the remains of a collapsed overpass. The wind howled through the wreckage, carrying the scent of ash and metal. O'Hara adjusted her scope. They'll never see it coming. They don't need to, Voss murmured. They just need to feel it. One shot. That was all it would take. A single, public, undeniable execution. No silent kill this time. The Dominion needed to hear the sound of their own mortality. Voss exhaled, centered his aim on the command balcony, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out like a thunderclap. A single, deafening crack that split the air over the ruins of Denver, shattering the illusion of invulnerability the Dominion had wrapped themselves in. Voss didn't need to see the impact to know it had landed. The target, a high-ranking Dominion commander, had been standing on the balcony of the fortified command post, his posture relaxed, his armor pristine. He had never known fear, never expected death. Now, his body crumpled, a gaping hole where his visor had once been. The effect was immediate. The alien soldiers below froze, their formations fracturing. This wasn't like the silent kills. Those had been phantoms, whispers in the dark. This was a declaration, a statement, a reminder that for all their power, they could be touched. And then the panic set in. Shouts in an alien tongue filled the air as Dominion warriors scrambled for cover, their weapons raised in search of a threat they could not see. Voss watched them through his scope, calm and unmoving. They weren't running toward an enemy. They were running from something. Confirmed kill, O'Hara murmured, eyes locked on the chaos below. You just kicked a hornet's nest. Good, Voss said. The Dominion's arrogance had carried them through the invasion without resistance. That arrogance was gone now, replaced by hesitation, uncertainty. They had relied so completely on their overwhelming force that the idea of an enemy who could strike them from nowhere had never entered their calculations. Patel's voice came through the comms, barely containing his excitement. Command reports similar strikes worldwide. Their officers are dropping, Captain. They don't know how to respond. Voss kept his voice level. They will soon. Because while the Dominion had been caught off guard, they weren't fools. They were a galactic power, a force that had subjugated entire worlds before Earth. They would analyze, adapt, retaliate. And when they did, Voss and his team had to be ready. Hours passed, then a day. The Dominion's retaliation came swiftly, as expected, but it wasn't the overwhelming show of force many had feared. Instead, they pulled back, not in full retreat, but in hesitation. Cities that had once been hunting grounds for Dominion patrols now sat in eerie silence, their streets void of alien soldiers. The invaders no longer walked the battlefield with impunity. They moved cautiously, in tighter formations, scanning rooftops and windows, aiming their weapons at shadows. The war had shifted, but Voss knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The final move was coming. The Dominion wouldn't abandon the invasion entirely, not after the losses they had sustained to take Earth in the first place. They would regroup, consolidate power, and then they would send their strongest to break whatever resistance remained. That meant one target remained. High General Zorthon, the architect of the invasion, the one who had led the Dominion forces into Earth's atmosphere with a full expectation that victory was inevitable. He had been untouchable, above the battlefield, beyond the reach of human retaliation. But now, the Dominion knew they were being hunted. And like all creatures that felt threatened, their leader had emerged from his fortress, not to fight, but to prove he could not be touched. He had come planetside. It was an act of control, a demonstration to his forces that he did not fear these invisible killers. His arrogance had not been shattered completely, and that made him vulnerable. Voss and his team tracked his movements carefully. Zorthun's warship hovered above the ruins of what had once been Washington, D.C., an ominous black monolith that cast an unbroken shadow over the landscape. From it, Dominion forces had established their new primary command center, a heavily fortified structure bristling with defenses. But defenses meant nothing to a weapon that could not be seen. The opportunity came when Zorthun stepped onto an elevated platform, his imposing figure framed by the smoldering remnants of Earth's old capital. His armor gleamed under the dim light, the insignia of Dominion conquest etched across his chestplate. Around him, dozens of elite warriors stood guard, weapons raised, scanning the ruins for any sign of attack. They were watching for threats. They were listening for battle. But death was already watching them. Voss adjusted his scope. The wind was light, the shot angle clear. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. O'Hara's voice was barely a whisper. "Take the shot." Voss exhaled, his heartbeat steady. The calculations ran through his mind. Wind speed, distance, the faint shimmer of the general's energy shield. There would be only one chance. Zorthun's shielding cycled every few seconds, just long enough to allow for environmental adjustments. A gap of less than half a second. That was all he needed. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet tore through the air, silent as death itself. It met its mark. The energy shield flickered, then failed completely as the round struck home, shattering Zorthun's visor and tearing through the skull beneath. The Dominion's high general collapsed, his body hitting the platform with a dull finality. For a moment, everything was still, and then the Dominion broke. The guards didn't move. They didn't fire their weapons. They didn't even react, because for the first time in the history of their kind, they had witnessed something they could not comprehend. The inevitable had been stopped. Voss didn't wait to see what happened next. He was already packing up his rifle, his hands moving with methodical precision. The war wasn't over. Not yet, but it would be, because this was the death knell of the invasion. Across the world, Dominion forces were already faltering, their commanders lost, their ranks crumbling. Fear had turned to panic, and panic had turned to retreat. Earth would not fall. Voss slung his rifle over his shoulder, glancing at O'Hara. "We don't need superior weapons," he murmured. She gave a small, knowing smile. "We just need one shot,